Oops. Okay, I'm pretty sure it's recording. Okay. Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narotamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Mudirayat Panchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhaivacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Okay, hi guys, welcome to the class. We are actually nearing the end of chapter 2 of the first canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, wherein we start to get the answers to the questions that the sages asked in the previous chapter. In chapter 1, Shonaka Rishi and the assembled Munis asked some questions to Sutta Goswami. They presented 6 questions, and I think two or three of them are being answered here. Well, actually, maybe the third one more near the end, but they asked what's the ultimate welfare for all humanity, and what's the essence of the sadhanas presented in the Shastra. So we went over verses that answered that, these seminal verses. Savai pum samparo dharmo yato bhakti radhoksajay. He asked what was the purpose of Krishna's appearance from the womb of Devaki. That would be the third question. The fourth question was, what are the magnanimous acts of Krishna, the Leelas of Krishna? The question number 5 was, what were the avatars of Krishna? And that's where we're just kind of segueing into with the verses, the last verses from last week's class, and then the verses that are coming up here to the end of the chapter and going into the third chapter. So that answers the questions of what are the avatars of Krishna. And then the 6th question was, when Krishna disappears from the world, where has Dharma taken shelter? So these are the 6 questions that were answered in the first chapter. And basically the Bhagavatam is an answer to these 6 questions. From all these 6 questions, it can be ascertained just by looking at them, more from 3, 4, 5, and 6, that Shonaka Rishi is very much interested in Krishna, because he's asking, what was the purpose of Krishna's appearance? What are the magnanimous acts of Krishna? What are the avatars of Krishna? And what happens when Krishna disappears? And then by inference, the first 2 questions, what's the ultimate welfare? We find that it's Dharma to Krishna. So from the first 6 questions, we can see very much that Shonaka Rishi is very interested in Krishna. And then coming into the second chapter here, Sutta Goswami, the first verse that he speaks is actually he honors the questions that the sages asked, and then in verse 5, he honors those questions by glorifying them. It's a beautiful verse. Munaya saru prishtoham bhavadvir loka mangalam yatkata Krishna samprashno yanatma suprasidati. So in the first verse, he honored them, and in this 5th verse, he honors the questions by glorifying them. He says, "Munaya sadhu prishtoham." So he says, "Sadhu." These questions are sadhu. They're very good. Sadhu means kind of like, it can mean like bravo. And why is he saying that bravo to these questions? Because loka mangalam, they're auspicious for the whole world. Kind of leading into the idea that the question can give ultimate welfare, and that's kind of an indirect way, I guess, of kind of answering the first 2 questions. So it's an indirect way of answering these questions, these first questions. And why? Yatkita Krishna samprashno, because the questions are about Krishna and yenatma suprasidati. This type of question itself gives satisfactions. So it gives satisfaction, and this was the first second question of the sages was, how to get this suprasidati. So I'm just going back to this verse for a second because it's quite nice. But Prabhupada's purport, it's quite nice. It's actually about how the whole world is a series of question and answers, and I think he talks about in the morning, the birds in the nest become busy with questions and answers. And in the evening, also the same birds come back again, busy with questions and answers. The human being, unless he is fast at sleep, is busy with questions and answers. So it's a nice purport, and it's about how the whole world is basically a series of questions and answers. The birds are asking, where are the worms? The cats are meowing, who's in heat? I'm in heat. Who's in heat? The humans too are asking questions. Humans ask a variety of different questions. Most of them tend to be they tend to be, I guess, a little bit lower on the scale of things. Humans tend, we're often interested in like who won the game, or what's Beyonce wearing to the awards. These types of questions are very common. You see them all over the place. Or what happens in the next season of America's Got Talent or whatever. So the questions in general people have are not, they're not very advanced. They're not kind of these existential questions that we're finding here in the beginning here, but they are getting knowledge from these questions. But it's not the type of knowledge that the Munis and the sages here are interested in, because it's not the type of knowledge that can really transform the self or soften the heart. So there's kind of knowledge of the world and what's going on in it, and it might provide some pleasure, satisfaction for some time, but these types of questions don't give the type of knowledge that really can transform oneself. But questions about Krishna, on the other hand, it's a knowledge that can purify the heart, and we heard about that in the verses that describe this intensification of faith and how it purifies the heart and leads one to bhav and prem. So questions about Krishna are different. They do give knowledge that changes the heart, and they can, the words that are used, yenatma suprasidati, they can actually give satisfaction. So pure bhakti is the way to achieve this. The ultimate welfare is pure bhakti. This is what they're asking about here, lokamangalam. And then after these verses, just to catch up to where we were, it goes through describing what pure bhakti is, and then basically how pure bhakti, there's my kitty cat on the window, basically how pure bhakti blossoms from shraddha to prema. So we have that description here, and that the root cause of bhakti is association with the devotees. And it's interesting because there's this verse, this nice verse, Krishna Bhakti Janma Mula Haya Sadhu Sangha, Krishna Prema Janmete Tenho Punya Puna Mukha Anga, that the root cause of bhakti is association with the devotees. One gets the seed of faith from that. But even when Krishna Prema awakens, association with the devotees is still an integral part. We know this famous verse from the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Sadhu Sangha, Sarva Shastra Kai, Labha Matra Sadhu Sangha, Sarva Siddhi Hai, that just a moment's association with the devotee, gives all perfection. But I think the verse means, when you kind of like look at it in relation to this other verse, Krishna Bhakta Janma and Krishna Prema Janma, it means that yes, a moment, all it takes is a moment's association to get the seed of bhakti. But it's not, in general, I suppose anything's possible in it, but it's not so much that you just have 1 second of association with a devotee and then it's all, there's no more need for that. That's what the verse is saying, is that although it just takes a second, even association with devotees is even carried on, all the way up into prem. So how this develops is described, like I said, the condensation of faith into the blossoming of prema. And the last verses that we went through, they were really for mentioning that bhakti is really just for Bhagavan, for the Supreme Lord, for Krishna. Where are we here? So that's what they were mentioning, that it was really for the Supreme Lord, that it's not this bhakti that has been described and what happens to it as it blossoms is not really meant for anybody else besides Krishna or Bhagavan. And we see some comparison of the guna avatars, and we'll get to the verses today that kind of like differentiate even more between who should be the object of bhakti, because bhakti is a very it's a very generous word. We see it a lot even today's milieu, like here in Samara. There's all kinds of there's yoga schools and a lot of these kind of beach traveling hippies kind of a devotion. And bhakti, the word bhakti is actually it's a very popular word. It's thrown around a lot, and people have different ideas of what it means. And I think what the Bhagavatam is doing right here is refining what bhakti really means. It did it in terms of its definition of what it is, what it's not, and now it's kind of refining it in relation to what the object of bhakti is. Because people think, bhakti could mean, and I've heard Guru Maharaj talk about this when he's kind of like gone and studied modern yoga practitioners or modern non-dualist writings and stuff like that, where sometimes maybe they miss the point. I know he talks about how sometimes they miss the point of what brahmacharya really means, or this idea of bhakti, like there's this Bhakti Fest, for example, is a big festival that's very popular now. And I'm sure it has a lot of good qualities and good effects from it, but people have this idea that devotion, devotion to social justice, for example, which again is not a bad thing, but it's not what the Bhagavatam is talking about here. Here, it's mentioned several times that this leads to liberation. This type of devotion to things like social justice, although it's great, it's still within the modes of nature, and it doesn't bring one out in the same way. So people think of devotion, they often they talk about it in relation to the family, devotion to humanity, social justice, devotion to one's exercise, yoga practice, devotion to one's dog, or whatever. But the Bhagavatam is clarifying here in these verses that we're about to read, which forms are the object of bhakti. So they talked about the guna and the guna avatars, and gave an example and drew out the focus that Vishnu was different than Shiva and Brahma, and that he was the one, the object of where one's bhakti should be focused. What's the verse? So we get to verse 26 here, and I'll read it. We went over it just at the end of the last class, but I thought there's more that can be said, so we'll read this. Mumukshavo Gaurarupam Hitva Bhutta Patinnata Narayana Kalashanta Bhajantihi Anasuyavaha. So Prabhupada translates it here. Those who are serious about liberation are certainly non-envious, and they respect all. They reject the horrible and ghastly forms of the demigods and worship only the all blissful forms and plenary portions of Lord Vishnu. So the Bhagavatam here is telling us again, refining again, which forms are the objects of bhakti. And here it says Narayana Kala. So Prabhupada translates that as the all blissful forms and plenary portions of Lord Vishnu. So it means, well, plenary portions and the different forms. So Vishnu has very many different forms. When Rupa Goswami is giving his definition of pure bhakti, he says Anukulyena Krishna Anushilanam, and the purports there by Jiva Goswami, perhaps, or I'm not sure if it's Jiva Goswami or Vishwanath Chakravarti, I can't remember, but they talk about it as this ongoing culture, internal and external, of bhakti towards the Lord, favorable bhakti, favorable service towards the Lord, towards Krishna, but it also includes his expansion forms and others related to him. They make that point. So it's Krishna, but it also includes these all blissful forms and plenary portions that Prabhupada is talking about here. And it also includes actually his devotees and the guru. So they make that point there. So they're differentiating between the demigods, the forefathers, and other living beings in this verse. Well, actually, that's the next verse. This verse, they're mostly just differentiating between the demigods and the forms of Lord Vishnu. These verses, I guess from a verse about 23 to the next verse 27, they're making the contrast first with the guna avatars that we went through, and now with other objects of worship that are quite popular in the Vedic world, I guess. Other objects of worship. That's saying that bhakti is really for Bhagavatam at Hoksajam, it said in this previous verse, that Bhagavatam at Hoksajam, it's really for Hoksaja. And why? Because Sattvam Vishuddham, that's what we spoke about before, because his forms are made of pure existence. So bhakti is also an aspect of the internal energy in this Vasudev platform that we talked about, Sattvam Vishuddham. And being an aspect of the internal energy, it only has as its object, which is the point that's being made here, something that is of the same nature. So bhakti being transcendental, the object of bhakti is also transcendental, and not these the demigods or the forefathers or humanity, whatever's being listed in these verses. So it's not they're not these material things, but a transcendental thing. And this verse is also talking about those desirous of liberation. That it refers to, in the previous verse, it referred to those who are desiring. Oh no, sorry, it's in this verse. Mumukshava, it says, those who are desiring of liberation. Right? Yeah, mumukshava. Those who are desirous of liberation will be rejecting these forms, because these forms are still tied up within the mesh of the gunas, and it's only Krishna who is, or these Shuddha-sattva forms, these Vishnu forms, that are able to pull one out of those things. Prabhupada makes this nice point here. I'll just read from the purport. He says that Vishnu is called Muktipada. Therefore, Vishnu is called Muktipada, or the personality of Godhead who can bestow upon us mukti, liberation, and none else. The demigods, being like other living entities in the material world, are all liquidated at the time of annihilation of the material structure. They are themselves unable to get liberation. What to speak of giving liberation to their devotees? The demigods can award the worshippers some temporary benefits only, and not the ultimate one. So, so I guess the verse is just describing those desiring liberation, like I mentioned, mumukshava. That these type of people follow the munis and direct their worship towards the forms of Shuddha-sattva and give up all the forms of the demigods. Here, hitva bhuta patin. So mumukshavo goraru, hitva bhuta patin, especially these gora rupam, these forms of the demigods that can be very ghastly. I think last class I mentioned that story about Srila Sridhar Maharaj beginning a debate with a Shakta and asking her to describe the form of Kali versus kind of the form of Krishna to make that point. What comes to my mind, I don't know if you guys have ever seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. That was one of my first introductions, I suppose, to, well, Prabhupada gives a list here of some of these Gora Rupam, these ghastly forms: Kala Bhairava, Smashaha Bhairava, Shani, Mahakali, Chandika. So these Gora Rupam, these ghastly forms where, to get close to them, one's liable to get cut, or, they're carrying all these sharp weapons and in kind of scary places and whatnot. So it reminds me of this Indiana Jones movie, which is probably a terrible representation, but there's some Kali worshippers in there who it's very dark, drinking blood from skulls and stuff. I don't know. I was young when I saw the movie, so it made an impression on me. But that's what's being spoken of here. Hitva Bhuta Patin, the demigods, especially Gora Rupam, these the ghastly forms. So the demigods, what Prabhupada is saying here is that it means that the forms, they're composed of the gunas of nature. And our tendency is to project our affection to objects of this world, actually, because they're easily perceptible. So, when we hear about Bhagavatam adhoksajam, is very much kind of transcendental and beyond the senses. So it's hard to, to just kind of, he's not easily perceptible. So it's natural that in a sense it would be harder to put one's faith in that, whereas the forms that are composed of the gunas of material nature and composed of the things that we want, some of those are listed in the next verses. It's kind of, in a sense, natural that we would do that. It's hard to place one's affection in something that's not perceivable, that one has to take solely on faith, especially when we see that through worship of the demigods, that people's desires are fulfilled very quickly, whereas in the worship of Adhoksaja, one's desires are not fulfilled. They're usually thwarted, perhaps for the higher good, but still. So the idea, is that you end up going where you project your attention. So one wants to avoid that. And again, I just like to point out here, the devotees are described as non-envious. So what it means in a sense, last time I think I spoke about it, the devotees being non-envious, it's mentioned in the first verse 2 of the Bhagavatam, Nirmatsaranam Satam, describing the devotees. But in this verse here, it means that the devotees are not, if somebody wants to worship the demigods, the devotees are not angry at them for that, or the devotees are not envious of them. That's fine. You worship where you have faith, and the results of that will come. You worship the animals, worship the forefathers, worship the earth, whatever. Gumarj makes a really nice point I mean, obviously the devotees want to give people the highest object, but certainly they're not envious if someone is worshiping somebody other than Krishna. Gumarj makes a really nice, a nice point in this regard when he says that that the object of service becomes refined in time. And I thought this was just a really wonderful and generous point. The idea is that Gumaraj says, is just start giving somewhere. So, just start this process of giving or worship. And in time, the worship itself, the act of giving itself, purifies one and refines one, and so then the object becomes more and more refined, and with the idea leading ultimately up to Krishna, who is the perfect object of worship. So we see that Gumarj encourages that. I remember an event when I was living at Odaria many moons ago. There was some small drama or something. There was a devotee who was kind of new and associating with some other devotees, and I think it was a Kaddishi or something like that, and some vegans had prepared these really nice preparations, and the devotee was really enthused that these they were, I guess they were non-devotees, had prepared these really nice vegan preparations, and the other devotees responded in some kind of very negative way, saying, well, it's vegan, but in fact they're just eating sin, or they're just eating that because it's a Kaddishi. And the guy was really turned off because he had, even though it was grains and it was a Kaddishi, he saw it as a nice act. And Gumaraj, I can't remember exactly what he said, but he basically commented like, the act of sacrifice and the act of giving was very present in these people's, offering, even though it was done with grains, it was done improperly, but that their heart was in the right place. Or vegans in general, perhaps the heart is in the right place, because they're trying to reduce suffering. They're trying to serve, in a sense. So the devotees generally should not criticize or be envious of those types of people, even if perhaps from our perspective, their focus is not the same. So, wherever the devotees see people giving, they should be giving or serving. They should be happy and not envious. But the Bhagavatam nevertheless is making very clear here that the object of bhakti is Krishna. So we can move on to text 27. Rajatama prakrita yaha sama shila bhajanti vai pitrir bhuta prajeshadin shri yaishvarya praje savaha. Those who are in the modes of passion and ignorance worship the forefathers, other living beings, and the demigods who are in charge of cosmic activities, for they are urged by a desire to be materially benefited with women, wealth, power, and aristocratic birth. So in this verse, we see that they're worshiping the forefathers, other living beings, such as their forefathers or some powerful manifestation, the demigods, and these fall within the modes of passion of ignorance. So what we're seeing in this verse is the divisions of faith, similar to how it's described in the Gita. The divisions of faith according to the gunas that it's described later on in the Gita. Those who are in Tamagun worship ghosts, and those in Rajagun worship the demons, those in Sattvagun worship the demigods. In the previous purport, he had made the comment that was it the previous purport? Yeah, in the previous purport, Prabhupada made the comment that the Lord expands himself into two categories. He calls them the integrated plenary portions and the separated parts and parcels. Sometimes we hear it called Svamsa and Vivinamsa. Or like we had discussed, Vishwanath had described it in the last class I was speaking. He spoke of the special position of Lord Shiva and Lord Vishnu because they're Ishwar Chaitanya, or as opposed to Jiva Chaitanya. So the parts and parcels the idea is that the parts and parcels, the Jiva Chaitanya, the dependent consciousness, they're meant for service to the whole. And so when one takes the part which is meant for service to the whole and separates it out and turns it into an object of worship, they are not proper objects for devotion in and of itself, of themselves. Actually, they're meant, to be focused, to be turned and focused towards the center. So when one takes one of these parts and parcels or dependent consciousness and separates them out and makes them the object of the object of bhakti, then what happens is they're really off center. And in a sense, this is really what idolatry is. Idolatry is not so much the worship of the Archa Vigraha. People see it that way. You're worshiping a statue, but what real idolatry is when one takes a part and alienates it from the whole and turns it into an object of worship. And what the verse here is saying is that people tend to choose objects of worship that are in the same mode as them, be it Rajas, Tamas, or Sattva, and it's explained a little bit differently in the Gita in terms of the examples, but the idea is the same. So the idea is, we hear, what's that saying? Birds of a feather flock together. So if one is in Tamagun, one will tend to choose objects of worship that are in that mode. And they do this because they preside over the things that people want. Like I mentioned, people want women or wealth or power, aristocratic birth. These are the things that people want. And these are the things mentioned in the verse that they will get. So those in Tamagun, like I said, they'll worship tamasic things. Those in Rajagun will worship the demigods. I mean, in today's world, maybe outside of this kind of Vedic context, you can see kind of the same thing, where the worship of celebrity especially is very popular now, or the worship of sports figures, powerful politicians. There was this Argentinian football player who I kind of forgot about him, but he passed away like not so long ago, probably within 6 months. I forget what his name is. Do you know what his, huh? Maratona. Maradona. Yeah, Maradona. And Padmanabh Maharaj was he mentioned him. I couldn't think of who he was. Surprised that I didn't know him, but then I remembered who he was because I saw his funeral, and Padmanabh Maharaj was talking about how this man had just been, because of his abilities in soccer and the way he won a certain game and the political situation all around it, this man had truly been elevated to the position of a demigod. Like he even had, they had churches dedicated to him and stuff. So we see that, and we see that with other, other celebrities. Beyonce is referred to as a goddess, and things like that. So there's a Vedic context, but it's pretty easy to see this in a modern context as well. And people worship Beyonce, for example, because they want what she has. She's beautiful and successful and covered in diamonds, and this is what people want, this fame and beauty. So we see that. It's a little bit strange for Westerners, I would say, to this talk of demigods. It's because perhaps we didn't kind of grow up with it in the same way that someone in a Hindu family would have. So it's, in a sense, it's a little bit easier for Western devotees to kind of like, yeah, the demigods. I mean, what does what does that mean? It seems like a bit of a strange thing. So it's not something that's very hard to give up. The Abrahamic faiths tended to try and squash these ideas, these demigods very early on, but they got absorbed somehow in different parts. But you see it in pagan religions, like the Greek gods. You have all sort. I mean, there are all sorts of demigods. Basically, Zeus is like Indra. I mean, the correspondences are there: Greek gods, Norse gods, the Egyptian gods. All these kind of demigods are found, all over the place. So it's actually not just some kind of. It's not really just a particular thing about Hinduism. It's found quite all over. And Vaishnavism, in that sense, is really it's really a nice kind of synthesis. I think of this like pantheist, pantheist worldview. I was getting confused between pantheist and panentheist, but no, pantheist worldview of all these different gods, and the monotheistic worldview. Like in Vaishnavism, demigods are given all respect, but they're seen as derived from or dependent or aspects of the supreme God, the supreme Purusha. They're, as I'll bring up the point a little bit later in the other verses, but they're seen as like kind of the limbs of the body of God in relation to the world. They oversee the movements of nature, etc. And it actually makes for a really nice kind of magical worldview, I would say, where humans are only kind of like a step on the ladder of being, and the environment is alive and personified. It fosters respect for the environment, respect for other living beings. The environment is alive and it's personified, so it's harder to abuse something when it's harder to pollute the water when you see it as Varuna, a person. So it makes for an environmentally conscious worldview. And that's all kind of subsumed within a transcendental, like a Vedanta. So it's sometimes when I've kind of like tried to look into like these kind of pagan religions and Wiccan religions and stuff, there's something very attractive about it. And I think it's that part, but there also, to me at least, feels like there's something missing too. And I think that's the kind of the theist or theistic Vedanta side. So I think Vaishnavism is a very nice synthesis of these types of things. The Abrahamic faith, when they remove that totally, I mean, you see it a little bit in the kind of like Mediterranean Catholic world and stuff, or perhaps the Catholic world in general. It's a little bit more attractive, but when you've got this kind of stark monotheism, it's kind of a little dry, unmagical. But the Bhagavatam is making clear here, as it also does in the Gita's 7th chapter. I've got that right here because I'll read a couple verses from it. That ultimately worship for those desiring liberation, what to speak of prem, bhav and prem should be for these spamsa forms that I mentioned, these Ishwar Chaitanya forms, the Vishuddha Sattva forms, not for the separated forms, because those ultimately are just parts and parcels, individual souls, and this is, in a sense, this is what idol worship really means. Demigods, I think it means half, but it also means, I think, it just means that they resemble God in a sense because they have these like powerful attributes that we know God to have. Anyhow, as Krishna is also free from envy, like the verse, the previous verse mentioned about the devotees, he allows people to worship as they choose. Ultimately, he says he gives them the faith. And ultimately, it is him through the agency of the demigods that people fulfill their desires. He calls them less intelligent in the Gita, so it sounds a little harsh, but it's not as an insult. It's just because they'll never be able to keep the things that they're after which they're chasing. So he calls them less intelligent in that sense, not to be mean. I don't think. I'll just read the verses here from chapter 7 because those whose intelligence have been stolen by various desires take refuge in other gods. Impelled by their own natures, they engage in various religious rituals. Whoever desires to faithfully worship a particular form, whichever one it is, I grant him the necessary conviction to do so. A person endowed with this faith, desiring to worship that form, and surely he attains the fulfillment of his desires only because of me. However, the results of these persons of meager intellect are perishable. Those who worship the gods attain the gods, but my devotees attain me. So in the Bhagavatam, he's a little bit more forward, I would say, about stopping this worship. We see, in relation to Indra and the Govardhan Leela, he's a little bit more forward about no worship of the demigods, but that's another story. So we'll put that aside. And I'll just come to verse 28 and 29 to kind of finish up this chapter. These verses are a glorification of Vasudev's description of the Shuddha Sattva forms, the ones that are worthy of worship. So now we're going to get some information about those forms that are worthy of worship. These verses here are really nice for chanting. They're very Vedic, I guess. I don't know if it's Vedic or whatnot, but they're very suitable for kind of chanting and repetition. They show how Vasudeva is at the foundation, or he's the goal of all the paths that are found in the Veda, or the processes, or that they're only successful with some participation of Vasudeva, some participation from him in the path. So I'll read these two verses. Vasudeva para Veda, Vasudeva para Maka, Vasudeva para Yoga, Vasudeva para Kriya. Vasudeva param jnanam, Vasudeva param tapa, Vasudeva paro dharmo, Vasudeva para gati. So in the revealed scriptures, the ultimate object of knowledge is Sri Krishna, the personality of Godhead. The purpose of performing sacrifice is to please him. Yoga is for realizing him. All fruitive activities are ultimately rewarded by him only. He is supreme knowledge, and all severe austerities are performed to know him. Religion is rendering loving service unto him. He is the supreme goal of life. So just before the section that I read from the Gita about the worshiping the demigods and whatnot, there's this the famous verse Vasudeva Savarmiti Sa Mahatma Sudurlabha, that after realizing all these things, the great souls come to see that Vasudeva is everything. After many births, the person possessing self-knowledge surrenders unto me. Vasudeva, realizing that Vasudeva is everything, and such a soul is very rare. So in the Gita, we find some similar ideas. There's this realization, glorification of Vasudeva. He makes the point that the gunas are a tangled mess and very difficult to go beyond. He says, Daiva hi esha gunamayi mama maya durataya. Then the wise see Vasudeva in everything as the goal of the verse that I quoted there. And then he goes on to those that worship within the modes. And what a shame it is, because all the results are perishable. So in the Gita, it starts with Vasudeva Samavriti, and then it explains what the results of worshiping the demigods are, and before it explains, kind of about what Vasudeva is. And in the Bhagavatam, it describes kind of like what the results of worshiping the devatas are. And then here it's giving the description of Vasudeva. So this word Vasudeva, we hear it repeated at the beginning of each pada, each line of this 8 times here in these 2 verses, Vasudeva Paraveda, Vasudeva Paramaka. So Vasudeva, there's probably a lot of Sanskrit meanings that one can derive from it. But the one that stuck in my head the most was Vasudev. Vasu meaning like Vasa, like Madhuvan Vasis. We say that all the time. Vasi is as a person who resides. So the idea with Vasudev is that he resides everywhere in all things, and that all things reside in him, like Narayana, like the name Narayana. But so Vasu means to reside, and it also means to veil or cover. So like the sun with its rays, he's covering the whole universe. And Deva means one who sports or plays, or one who shines, this playful kind of God. So this word Vasudeva, but on a sweeter level, of course, Vasudeva particularly means, to the devotees at least, the divine son of Devaki, and Vasudeva with a short A. And what this means, and it's a profound thing, is that this is that not only does he pervade all things and all things reside in him and he resides in all things, but that he also has a father. That's what this name refers to. You see it in the very beginning when Prabhupada starts his commentaries. It means the son of Vasudeva. So it means that God has a father. God has Vatsalya Ras and all the implications of this. So this is the kind of sweeter side of that word Vasudeva, that he's the only real object of worship is proclaimed here over and over, that Vasudeva is everything. So Vasudeva Paraveda, of the revealed scripture, the Veda, Vasudeva is the ultimate object of knowledge. That's Bhagavad Gita, basically 15:15. Vedaischa sarve aham eva vedyo vedanta veda eva chaham. I alone am to be known by the Veda. Indeed, I am the compiler of the Vedanta and the knower of the Veda as well. So Gumarsh often makes a point that although the Veda appears to deal with many subjects, many purposes, there's an underlying unity that ultimately teaches about liberation and in its furthest extent, love of God, with one object of knowledge, Krishna. The Vedas give this Sambandha Tattva, Abhideya Tattva, and Prayojan Tattva. Gumarsh speaks of the Vedanta as the first attempt to show the concordance of all these ideas that are found in the Vedic literature and the Upanishads. And here, Krishna, in the Gita, Krishna says he's the compiler of the Veda, I guess as Vyasadeva, and as Vyasadeva wrote the Vedanta Sutra. So he's the knower of the Veda also. We see that because he explains it very clearly to Arjuna on the battlefield. And the idea too is that the Veda it's a body of knowledge that's already there. It's not this knowledge is alive, and it's a person, and it can act towards us. So it's this idea of descending knowledge, that like Umarsh likes to say, knowledge is a person. Knowledge has an agenda, and it can act in relation to us. So Vasudeva Paraveda, Vasudeva Paramaka. So that's referring to sacrifice, right? Yes. So another name for Vasudeva is Yagya. Prabhupada mentions this, or sacrifice. Yagyobais Vishnu, another name for Vishnu is sacrifice. The Gita says, Bhoktaram Yagyatapasam Sarvaloka Maheshwaram Suhidam Sarvabhutam, like that. The enjoyer of all the results of sacrifice, of all austerities. This is Krishna. And when describing this verse in the Gita, I think it's this verse, Guru Maharaj really beautifully says, the absolute is eternally situated in acts of sacrifice. So that's where one finds Krishna, especially in this age. We hear that the Yuga Dharma of this age is the Sankirtan Yagya, and that's one finds Krishna there. The best way to come in contact with Vasudeva is through this sacrifice of chanting Yagyai Sankirtana Praya Yajantihi Sumedasa. So sacrifice for this age is chanting the holy name, and there's nothing that's more Krishna than his name. Vinatvam Namanamino, we hear. And then in relation to the demigods that we were speaking of beforehand, it's nice. There's this really nice story of Bharat Maharaj and how he's described at the very beginning when he's installed on the throne by his father to rule over the entire world. It gives a really nice idea of how one sees the demigods as the limbs of the Lord, like I was mentioning before. And in relation to sacrifice, he was very learned and an affectionate king. And so he ruled in kind of in the Vedic context. That meant that he performed all these different sacrifices in order to, provide facility and security for his kingdom. So he performed these many different types of sacrifice. And the verses in the Bhagavatam say that he performed them especially for the satisfaction of Vasudeva. And connecting back to that orientation regarding the demigods, Bharat Maharaj saw them all as different limbs of Vasudeva's body. For instance, he saw Indra as the arms of Vasudeva, Surya as his eyes. And again, this is kind of a magical worldview where it's alive, it's a person. But Maharaj Bharat considered that the oblations, they were offered to the different demigods, but they were actually offered to the different limbs of Lord Vasudeva. So this idea of sacrifice permeates, the sacred texts. There's the famous Purusha Sukta where the Purusha, the primordial person, creates by sacrificing his own limbs. Pretty cool. So Vasudeva Para Yoga, that the object of meditation is Vishnu. At least according to the Bhagavatam and the Bhagavad Gita, you see in the teachings of Kapila Dev, he gives like pretty complex and detailed instructions on the execution of yoga, I guess kind of like Ashtanga yoga, but the object of meditation is very clearly Vishnu, Vasudeva. In the Gita too, this path is also described, and Arjuna asks about it because it's very complicated and requires a lot of effort on the part of the practitioner, very much an ascending path. And Arjuna asks about it and asks about success because it sounds like it would be very possible to fail. And he says, yes. Krishna responds, yes, it's very difficult, but with practice and detachment, it's certainly possible. And even if one should be unsuccessful and fall away, the results will still be there in terms of a favorable birth will be awaiting him. But ultimately, he ends the chapter after kind of answering Arjuna's insecurity or doubt by saying, Yogi nama pisarvesham matgatin antar atmana shadavan bhajate yomam same yukta tamo mataha. The one who in full faith worships him in devotion is most united with him, taking yoga to its highest reach, ultimately meaning Bhakti yoga. So it's made clear that the object of meditation is Vasudeva or Vishnu, or a form of the Paramatma anyway, may be meditated on. But it's understood in the Bhagavatam or the Gita. It's just a facet of Vasudeva's personality relative to the path of yoga. Some schools have a different idea. I interacted a little bit with the Shivananda school of yoga, which are really nice. So they give a really kind of like complete sense of what yoga is in terms of pranayama, and it wasn't just gymnastics. They had a sense of the scripture and devotion and stuff. It's still a Advaitic, but they say, for example, that you can meditate on anything. It could be a flower, it could be a candle, and that it's just the one pointedness of mind, or the samadhi, that, or that I guess it's referred chitta vritta nirodha, that is important. And I found that in their books. You know, they were saying you can choose whatever you want to meditate on. The point is to focus the mind. But Kapila Dev and the Bhagavatam take a different stance on that. So Vasudeva Parakriya, all action is dependent on him. So again, with each of these lines, we can kind of like, they're very, I don't know if Upanishadic is the right word or what, but you can really go back to the Gita and find you know, explanations of all these, and this, that all action is dependent on him, we find in the 18th chapter and the 14th and 15th verses, where he's describing the 5 factors of action, the body, the performer of action, the senses, the various types of endeavors, and ultimately God. Vasudeva is the ultimate factor in all action. We hear that not a blade of grass moves without the will of God. And it also means that in order to be successful in varnashram or any of these actions, it ultimately needs to be centered in some way on Vasudeva Samsiddhi or Haritoshanam. So the next, Vasudeva Paragyana, he is supreme knowledge. Rajavidya, we hear in the Gita, the king of knowledge. Knowledge is dependent on him. This type of knowledge, he is this type of knowledge. It comes from up to down. The name of Krishna is non-different from Krishna, and it's the life of transcendental knowledge. We hear Mahaprabhu say, he says, Vidya Vadu Jivanam. So again, the idea is that knowledge is a person alive with an agenda, and it acts in relation to us. Vasudeva Paratapa, all austerities are aimed at him. All austerities are dependent on him for success. So we see the austerities of Devaki and Vasudeva in relation, right, to Vasudeva, their son. So they performed austerities in relation to him, devotional austerities. So there is austerity in the life of the devotee, things like fasting for Janmashtami Ekadashi, taking on vows for Kartik. But really devotional austerities are twofold, and they're found in the divisions of Sharanagati. So devotees really are more interested in Sharanagati, surrender, than they are in austerities. Gita, of course, Krishna, of course, sends the Gita Sarva Dharman Parityaja Mamekam Sharanam Vraja. So he's saying, surrender to me. He's not saying do austerities towards me. But still within that surrender, we have the devotional austerities of Anukulyasya Samkalpa Pratikulyasya Varjanam. So accepting the favorable and rejecting the unfavorable. These are the austerities of the devotees. It can be a very pleasurable experience. It can also be a very unpleasurable experience. Sometimes giving up the unfavorable things is very, very austere to do. But Krishna is a very soft person with a very soft heart. So these harsh austerities are not so much a part of bhakti. So Vasudeva Paro Dharmo. We already heard that earlier in the chapter. Sabai Pumsam Paro Dharmo. So ultimately, the Paro Dharma is bhakti, to render loving service to him. The actions of bhakti, like hearing and chanting, dedicated to him, since God and love of God are one and the same. Vasudeva Paro Dharma, Vasudeva Paragati. So he's the supreme goal of life. The goal of prema and liberation are dependent on him for success, for results. And also, he is the Panchama Purushartha. So in the beginning of the Chaitanya Charitamrita, we hear about the 4 goals of human life and how they're rejected as Kaitava Dharma, darkness, cheating, and but there's this Panchama Purushartha, the 5th goal of life, love of God, directed to Vasudeva. So that's the end of that verse. And just to end this section, I guess I would just end by noting that the whole of the Bhagavatam begins with a statement of recognition and acknowledgement towards this Vasudeva. With the famous, invocation, the famous first words of the Bhagavatam, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. and Janmadi Yasya Yataha, so from whom everything emanates, this Vasudev from whom everything emanates. And these verses that we just read, text 28 and 29, these are kind of an expansion, giving examples of how all these things within the scripture rest on him. Sutta Goswami is glorifying and acknowledging this Bhagavate Vasudeva here. And interestingly, it's worth pointing out that these verses are almost repeated exactly in the second canto, where Lord Brahma is explaining the Svarga, the primary creation, to Narada Muni, and he states practically the same thing, just changing the word Vasudev to Narayana. And we get a glimpse into that act of cosmic creation in the next 4 verses, which we'll save for next time, where it describes this primary creation, Svarga, where the Lord is situated in his transcendental position, but creates the energies of cause and effect. And this is one of the 10 subjects of the Bhagavatam, of Svarga, the creation. So it tells us a little bit about where we came from, a little bit about where we are, and of course later on in the Bhagavatam it tells us where we want to go. And then it segues into the 3rd chapter with the Purusha avatars, gives a list of 22 very famous avatars, the pinnacle being of Krishna and Balaram. This Krishna and Balaram, then we get, who do we get after that? Kalki, Buddha and Kalki, I think, just to kind of end it off. And then avatari hi asankhya, that actually there's not 22 avatars, there's not 10 avatars, there are asankhya, a famous line that Gumaraj likes to quote often. And then ending with ete chamsa kalam, what doesn't end the chapter, but ends the ladder of avatars. So these are the forms of the Lord that are meant to be the object of bhakti. And I'll end here because it's 10:30. Does anybody have anything that they would like to share? I think questions, if you're not on Facebook, we could take some questions, or if you have some questions that you'd like to share on the Tattva Vivek, that's fine too. I think I left it so you can unmute yourselves if anybody has any comments. Okay. Nice speaking with everybody. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Haribol.
Haribol, thank you.
Thank you.